Hey everyone, and welcome back to Tech Unplugged. So today we are going to do a really fascinating deep dive into the world of red teaming. Um, you might have heard this term, especially if you're in like the tech field or the security world.
Yeah.
But what does it actually mean? And more importantly, like, why should anyone even care about it?
Well, you can think about it kind of like this. You built this incredibly secure, digital fortress. And then
Yeah.
red teaming is like saying, okay, let's bring in this specialized squad of ethical hackers.
Okay.
So they're the good guys, but their job is to try and, break in.
Right.
Not to cause any damage, but really try and find those vulnerabilities before the bad guys do. We've actually gone through a ton of information, a lot of it focusing on the tools and techniques they use and how this whole area is, always changing.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and that's kind of what we want to unpack today as a deep dive. So we want to give you a really clear picture of what red teaming is all about. Highlight some of the really cool stuff they use and explain why it's becoming so important, especially as our world, gets more and more interconnected.
Yeah, for sure.
And we want to do all this without, getting too lost in the jargon.
Right.
We want to make it understandable and, hopefully even have some of those like aha moments for our listeners.
Exactly. Those light bulb moments.
Yeah, exactly. So let's get started.
Okay, so at its core, red teaming is really all about challenging assumptions.
Okay.
Really rigorously testing the defenses that are already in place.
Okay.
So whether we're talking about an organization's cybersecurity, their infrastructure, or maybe even a government's strategic plans, or, even just a new business idea, red teaming is all about finding those points of failure, those weaknesses. And it's by doing this that we can ultimately make things stronger, more resilient, build better systems.
Should make sense. I mean, if you don't know where the weaknesses are, how can you ever strengthen them? Exactly. It's about proactive identification.
Yeah.
And from what we've seen in our research, a lot of red teaming happens within the world of cybersecurity.
Right.
And what these teams do is they simulate these real-world cyber attacks.
Okay.
And it's fascinating because they use this to give organizations this deep understanding of, how good are their detection mechanisms?
Okay.
How quickly can they respond
I see.
if something happens? And one really interesting thing that we found in one assessment was that so many organizations, they just focus so heavily on endpoint protection.
What does that mean, like protecting individual devices?
Exactly, like your laptop, your phone, or even a specific server.
Okay.
But what they really need is stronger network level defenses.
That makes sense because if you just protect individual devices, but the network itself is vulnerable, it doesn't really matter.
Exactly.
Right.
An attacker, they might find one weak point, and then from there they can move laterally throughout the entire network.
Right.
So that's a huge takeaway from our research. So it's not enough to just have, your antivirus on your computer.
No, it's about a much more holistic security approach.
Oh, okay.
And another thing that was highlighted was the importance of continuous training for staff.
Oh, yeah. You've got to keep
Yeah.
people up to date on the latest threats.
Exactly, because the threat landscape is constantly evolving.
Right.
And even more than that, leadership needs to be fully aware of all the different ways these attacks can actually unfold.
So it's like a top-down and a bottom-up approach.
Yeah, you need buy-in at all levels.
Okay. So we've talked about cybersecurity, but it's really interesting to see how this concept of proactive testing is starting to go beyond that.
Oh, absolutely.
Like we even saw the EU AI Act mentions this thing called adversarial testing for AI models before they're released.
Exactly. And that's a great example of how recognizing weaknesses proactively is becoming crucial in many areas, not just cybersecurity.
Yeah, especially with technologies like AI becoming so integrated into everything.
Exactly. It's not just about building something. It's about making sure it's robust from the start.
Now, one thing that really stood out in our research was all the different tools that red teams use.
Oh, yeah. There's a huge range of both open source and commercial tools.
Yeah, it's like an arsenal.
It is. And they're all designed to simulate attacks.
So let's dig into some of these tools.
Okay, so let's start with tools that are specifically made for testing AI vulnerabilities,
Okay.
because AI is such a big deal these days.
And they need their own special tools.
Exactly. Because AI systems, especially large language models, they work so differently from traditional software.
Okay.
So there's one called Garak, which is supported by NVIDIA. And what's interesting about this one is that it helps identify issues like unintentional data leaks.
What does that mean exactly?
So imagine you're talking to a chatbot and it accidentally reveals some private information that it was trained on.
Oh, wow. That would be bad.
Yeah, it's a real concern with these large language models.
So GRAC helps prevent that.
Exactly. It helps red teams identify those vulnerabilities.
Okay. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah. And then there's another one called Inspect, which was created by the UK AI Safety Institute.
Okay.
And this one is really comprehensive. It can do things like evaluate the performance of AI models.
Okay.
And it can even do these really complex assessments,
Oh.
things like prompt engineering and multi-turn dialogues.
So it's really putting these AI models through the paces.
Exactly. It's about finding those breaking points.
That makes sense.
And because AI is so new and so complex, these tools are really essential
Okay.
because AI models, they behave in ways that we can't always predict.
Right. It's not like traditional software where you can just look at the code and see what it's going to do.
Exactly. AI is much more emergent. Its behavior comes from the data it was trained on.
Okay.
So tools like Inspect, they help us understand how these models might behave in unexpected situations.
That's really important, especially as we start to rely on AI for more and more things.
Absolutely. And then we also came across jailbreak evaluation, which focuses on making sure AI models don't create harmful outputs.
So it's like a safety check.
Exactly, because sometimes people try to trick AI models into saying things they shouldn't.
Oh, wow. So it's like a game of cat and mouse.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the stakes are getting higher as AI becomes more powerful.
Okay, so we've talked about AI testing, but what about more traditional cybersecurity red teaming? What tools do they use?
Okay, so one really well-known one is the Metasploit framework.
I think I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's pretty popular, and it's basically a command and control framework.
What does that mean?
It basically allows red teamers to manage and control systems they've compromised during a simulated attack.
So it's like their base of operations.
Exactly. And what's really cool about Metasploit is that it's modular, so you can plug in different exploit code.
And what's exploit code?
It's basically a set of instructions that can take advantage of a known vulnerability.
Oh, okay.
So Metasploit lets you try out all these different attack scenarios.
That makes it really versatile.
Exactly. It's a really powerful tool.
And we also saw something called Z Attack Proxy or ZAP.
Yeah, that's a great one for web application testing.
What does it do?
So it basically lets red teamers sit between a user's web browser and the web server they're communicating with.
So they can see everything that's happening.
Yeah, and even manipulate the data being exchanged.
Wow, so they can really test the security of web applications.
Exactly. And ZAP can also automatically scan for common web application vulnerabilities, like those listed in the OWASP Caveat 10.
So it's like a Swiss Army knife for web app security.
You could say that.
Okay, so where do red teams find all these tools?
Well, a lot of them are open source and hosted on platforms like GitHub.
GitHub, like the code repository.
Yeah, exactly. And it's amazing because it's this huge collection of tools for everything from Active Directory visualization to credential collection to vulnerability checks.
Okay, so I need a quick explanation. What is Active Directory?
Sure. So Active Directory is basically this directory service that Microsoft created.
Okay.
And it's used in a ton of corporate networks to manage all sorts of things like user accounts, computer access, security policies, really all the important stuff.
So it's kind of like the control center for the network.
Yeah, you can think of it that way.
Okay.
And there's this tool called Bloodhound that helps red teamers visualize how all the different parts of Active Directory are connected.
Okay.
So they can see, potential attack paths.
That's really clever.
Yeah. And then there's another tool called Snaffler, which is designed to collect user credentials.
So like usernames and passwords.
Exactly. And then there's LinWinPN, which helps with enumeration and vulnerability checks on both Linux and Windows systems.
So it's a cross-platform tool.
Yeah, it's really versatile. And these are just a few examples.
Wow, there are so many tools out there.
There are, and it's really amazing because platforms like GitHub have made these tools accessible to anyone.
That's both good and bad, right?
It's a double-edged sword.
Okay, and we also saw some command and control frameworks listed like Havoc and Covenant.
Yeah, those are really important for managing compromised systems during an attack simulation.
So they're like the puppet master.
In a way, yeah, they allow the red team to remotely control the compromised machine.
That's pretty impressive.
It's a very sophisticated level of control.
And what about tools for more specific tasks?
Well, there are tons of those too.
Okay, give me some examples.
Okay, so there's GoBuster and FeroxBuster, which are used to brute force website directories.
What does brute forcing mean?
It basically means trying every possible combination until you find something that works.
Okay, so they're trying to find hidden content on websites?
Exactly, things that might not be linked publicly.
I see.
And then there's GoWitness, which takes website screenshots.
That sounds kind of basic.
It does, but it can actually be really useful for reconnaissance.
so?
Well, sometimes just looking at a screenshot can reveal a lot of information.
Like what?
Things like outdated branding or exposed administrative panels, or even error messages that could hint at vulnerabilities.
Oh, wow. So it's about looking for those subtle clues.
Exactly, those little details that can give you an edge.
Okay. And what about tools for evading detection?
Well, those are essential for any good red team.
Because you don't want to be caught, right?
Exactly. You want to be as stealthy as possible.
Okay, so what kind of tools are we talking about?
Well, there's Shelter, which is used for shellcode injection.
And what's shellcode?
It's basically a tiny piece of code that's designed to give you control of a system.
Okay, so it's like a backdoor.
Yeah, kind of. And Shelter helps hide that shellcode from security software.
That's pretty sneaky.
Yeah, it's all about staying under the radar.
Okay, and what else?
There are also things like the prevent default JavaScript method.
What's that?
It's basically a way to spoof links.
So you click on a link and it takes you somewhere you weren't expecting.
Exactly. And it's really effective in social engineering attacks.
Oh, wow. So it's all about tricking people into doing something they shouldn't.
Yeah, that's a big part of social engineering.
Okay. It's amazing how clever some of these techniques are.
It is, and it really shows the level of thought that goes into red teaming.
And one thing that I found really interesting was how red teams can even repurpose things like Google services.
Oh yeah, GC2 or Google Command and Control.
That sounds crazy.
It's basically using things like Google Sheets or Google Drive for communication between infected devices and the attackers.
So it's like hiding in plain sight.
Exactly, because Google services are so ubiquitous, the traffic just blends in with all the other normal internet activity.
That's really clever.
It's a way to make malicious activity look completely innocent.
And we also saw that AI is now being used to analyze and categorize all these red teaming tools that are out there.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it helps security researchers stay ahead of the curve.
By understanding the tools that the bad guys might be using.
Exactly. It's like a constant arms race.
Okay, so here's where things get even more interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
Because all these tools are designed to simulate attacks, they also attract the attention of actual cybercriminals.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge problem.
So the bad guys are actually using the same tools that the good guys use to test security.
Exactly. And it's not surprising because these tools are designed to be effective.
Right, they're designed to find and exploit vulnerabilities.
Exactly. And so the bad guys are basically taking advantage of that.
And they're using them for their own malicious purposes.
Yeah, they're using them to automate vulnerability discovery and to launch more sophisticated attacks.
So it's like this dual-use nature of these tools.
Exactly. They can be used for good or for bad.
And it sounds like open source repositories like GitHub are a big part of the problem.
They are, because they make these tools so easily accessible.
And that's great for security researchers, but it's also great for cybercriminals.
Exactly. It's a double-edged sword.
So we see cybercriminals using these tools as is.
Yeah, they just download them and use them.
And sometimes they even modify them.
Yeah, to try and evade detection by antivirus software and other security measures.
So it's a constant cat and mouse game.
It really is. And the stakes are incredibly high.
And we also saw that supply chain attacks are a growing concern.
Oh yeah, those are really dangerous.
And apparently red team tools can be used in those attacks as well.
Yeah, because supply chain attacks are all about compromising third-party components that are used in software development.
Okay, so can you explain that in simpler terms?
Sure. So imagine you're building a house and you get your bricks from one supplier, your lumber from another, and so on.
Okay.
A supply chain attack is like if someone tampers with those materials before they get to you.
So you end up building a house with faulty materials.
Exactly. And you might not even realize it until it's too late.
Oh, wow, that's scary.
It is. And in the software world, this can happen too.
So like if a developer uses a compromised library or tool in their software.
Exactly. Then all the software that uses that component becomes vulnerable.
And that could affect a huge number of people.
It could. And red team tools can actually be used to find those weaknesses in the supply chain.
So it's really important to think about security at every stage of the process.
Absolutely. From the initial design all the way to the end user.
Okay, so this all really highlights the importance of ethics in red teaming.
Oh, absolutely.
And the need for constant vigilance.
Yeah, both red and blue teams need to stay up to date on the latest threats and techniques.
Because the bad guys are always coming up with new ways to attack.
Exactly. It's a never-ending battle.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the tools of red teaming, but it sounds like having the right mindset is just as important.
It's absolutely crucial.
So what exactly does that mean? What is a red team mindset?
Well, it's really about approaching problems with a critical and questioning perspective.
Okay.
It's about challenging assumptions, looking for weaknesses, and considering alternative explanations.
So it's not just about knowing how to use the tools.
No, it's about thinking like an attacker.
Okay.
It's about putting yourself in their shoes and trying to understand how they might approach a target.
That makes sense.
And it's about being relentless in your pursuit of vulnerabilities.
So it's like a mental game as much as a technical one.
It really is, and it's a skill that could be applied to any field, not just cybersecurity.
And we saw in the Red Teaming Handbook that it's important to be aware of cognitive biases.
Oh yeah, those can really trip you up.
Like, what kind of biases are we talking about?
Well, things like obedience to authority.
So just blindly following orders?
Yeah, or the pressure to conform to the consensus of a group.
So not wanting to rock the boat?
Exactly. And those biases can prevent you from seeing things clearly.
Okay, so how do you avoid those biases?
Well, the handbook outlines several techniques.
Like what?
Well, things like structured brainstorming.
So encouraging people to think outside the box.
Exactly. And also stakeholder analysis.
What's that?
It's basically identifying all the different people who are affected by a decision
Okay.
and understanding their perspectives and their potential motivations.
So it's like a 360-degree view of the situation.
Exactly. And then there's argument mapping.
What's that?
It's basically a way to visually lay out the different arguments for and against a particular course of action.
Sure.
And it helps you identify weaknesses in your logic.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. And then there's pre-mortem analysis.
What's that one?
It's basically imagining that your plan has already failed
Okay.
and then working backward to figure out why it failed.
So it's like a thought experiment.
Exactly. And it can be really helpful in identifying potential problems before they actually happen.
That's a really interesting approach.
It is, and it's something that everyone can benefit from, not just red teams.
And we also saw this concept of red cells.
Yeah, those are really fascinating.
So these are basically teams that are dedicated to thinking like the enemy.
Exactly. They try to replicate the adversary's motivations, their tactics, their behaviors.
So it's like having your own internal spy agency.
In a way,
Yeah.
yeah. But instead of gathering intelligence, they're trying to find the weaknesses.
That's a really clever idea.
It is, and it can be really effective in anticipating potential attacks.
And it helps you understand not just how an attack might happen, but also why.
Exactly. It's about getting inside the head of the attacker.
Okay, so we've talked about the red team. Now, what about the blue team?
Ah, the defenders.
Yeah, so they're the ones who are responsible for actually protecting the systems.
Exactly. They're the ones who take the insights from red teaming and use them to strengthen their defenses.
So they're the ones who are on the front lines.
In a way, yeah, they're the ones who are constantly monitoring for threats and responding to incidents.
And it sounds like they focus on building layered security.
Yeah, that's a key concept.
So it's not just about having one big wall.
No, it's about having multiple layers of defense.
So if one layer fails, there's another one behind it.
Exactly. It's about making it as difficult as possible for an attacker to get through.
That makes sense.
And blue teams also focus on continuous monitoring.
So they're always looking for suspicious activity.
Yeah, they're constantly watching the logs, looking for anomalies, anything that's out of the ordinary.
And they also have incident response plans.
Absolutely. Those are essential.
So if something does happen, they know exactly what to do.
Yeah, they have a playbook ready to go.
That's really important because time is of the essence in a security incident.
It really is. You have to act quickly to contain the damage.
And it sounds like threat intelligence plays a big role for both red and blue teams.
It does, because threat intelligence is all about understanding the current threat landscape.
So who are the attackers? What are they doing? What are their goals?
Exactly. And that information is crucial for both offensive and defensive teams.
So red teams can use it to simulate realistic attacks.
Yeah, and blue teams can use it to identify and mitigate vulnerabilities.
So it's like a shared resource.
It is. And it's essential for staying ahead of the curve.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
But I think the big takeaway is that the principles of red teaming can be applied to so many different areas.
Absolutely. It's not just about cybersecurity.
It's about critical thinking, challenging assumptions, and looking for weaknesses.
And it's a skill that can be learned and practiced.
Yeah, anyone can benefit from having a bit of a red team mindset.
Exactly. It's about being proactive and thinking ahead.
And especially as the world becomes more complex and interconnected.
The need for red teaming is only going to increase.
So we encourage you to think about how you can apply these principles in your own life and work.
What assumptions are you making? What blind spots might you have?
It's always good to challenge yourself and to think critically.
And to remember that the best defense is a good offense.
So stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay ahead of the game.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive into red teaming.
We hope you found it informative and engaging.
And we'll see you next time on Tech Unplugged.
Stay tuned.